Well, welcome to the Palladium podcast. This is episode 2. I'm Jonah Bennett, editor-in-chief of the magazine.
I'm Ash Milton, managing editor.
And I'm Wolf Tivey, another editor.
Another editor. All right. Well, I think the first thing we can do is go over one of the questions we got last week. I'm ignoring all the other ones because this to us is the most important. If you were a dinosaur, what dinosaur would you be?
All right. I think I would be a velociraptor. I think the velociraptor is, in many ways, the most human-like. It's a social animal that it's a carnivorous. You could imagine them having some intelligence and some civilization, even though they didn't.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
Ash.
when I have a dinner in the week, I'll be able to eat some of their descendants in chicken form. Hey
man, at least they have descendants.
Yeah, but I'm all about, you want to go out with a bang, so I would be a brachiosaur, because they're the most built ones of the entire timeline.
Okay. I'd be a triceratops because when you skewer other dinosaurs on the horns, you can eat it like a lamb skewer. Because my triceratops would have a mutation such that its tongue would be long enough to reach onto its horns. You know what I'm saying?
And its tongue would have teeth, of
Yeah,
course.
its tongue would. Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Absurd.
So that's enough.
This is
that's
hard-hitting
enough of that.
analysis.
That's enough of that.
Let's flip over to some of the pieces. Jonah, I know you wanted to kind of give a summary before we start, so...
Yeah, well, here's what we're going to do for the episode. We're going to individually summarize both of the articles that were published in the last week. We're going to start with the piece by Stephen Borthwick on China, entitled China's Global Ambitions Can't Escape Soft Power Competition. And then, most recently, we've got another one by Pasha Kamyshev called Facebook's Political Problems Are Inherent to Centralized Social Media. So, Ash, let's start off with a brief summary of Borthwick's China article, and then we'll launch into some discussion on that.
Sure, okay. So in terms of the article, I mean, as the title sort of gives away, soft power in relation to the rise of China is the main theme being looked at. The article opens up with some discussion about China starting at around the age of Augustus in the Roman Empire, and looking at how it was this cultural force and not just an economic one. Obviously, one of the things that comes up a lot in discussion is that insofar as China is a source of competition for the West, it's not actually in a cultural sense so much as a political one and a rival for development. So what the piece does is it looks at how modern China has focused on that development aspect and has, in a sense, accepted the prerequisites of the liberal world order. It's spoken the same language as it justifies itself. It's won cooperation by, entering bodies like the WTO, setting up forums that kind of mimic a lot of the Western development framework, and thereby getting into a lot of countries and increasing their global influence and scope. What the piece does is it looks at also how that is distinct from the early era of the People's Republic under Mao, where an ideological form of cultural power was something that they attempted to construct. This didn't actually work very well. China was too poor to kind of capitalize on this Maoist cultural mimicry. And so the strategy has changed. Now, on the other hand, China actually has a large amount of economic power and a growing amount. Belt and Road being obviously the most well-known one, but the piece cites other examples. China's basically taken control of Turkmenistan's petroleum market in Central Asia. It supported the Taliban as kind of an anti-Western force to an extent. And there's the Lapis Lazuli corridor, which the West has sought to set up, which is in competition with China. So we can see that there's competition in a lot of these regions, and that purely economic power is not just going to be staying economic. And so the central thesis of the piece basically focuses on this, that hard economic power is something that, in a sense, by its nature, has to eventually become political and cultural power. And that's quite grounded, actually, in China's own understanding of how power works. So this is the central thesis of the piece here.
Okay, more directly to that, So can you just straightforwardly give the strongest argument why economic power can't remain purely economic power?
I mean, I don't know if the piece actually gave that on a theoretical level. What the piece focuses on, and what I think is probably the correct question to ask, is does China think that economic power can just stay economic power? And the answer is no. And the reason we know this is because China, and this will be a bit of a controversial statement, but it's reflected in the piece, China's or specifically the Chinese Communist Party's understanding of the world comes out of the Marxist tradition, which is a materialist form of analysis, which sees culture, politics, and so on coming out of material conditions. And particularly something that comes up in this piece, which I think was quite useful to reflect on, is the fact that China has actually got a long history, specifically the party has a long history, of using this kind of cooperation in order to ultimately increase its own political power through the United Front strategy. So this was employed against religious groups, rival parties, other countries to an extent. It was employed during the rivalry with the Soviet Union. Essentially, the whole method...
Can you briefly explain the United Front strategy?
Yeah. So essentially the idea here is that when the party is in a situation where there is some kind of rival that they don't currently have the power to really overcome or force submission to themselves, they enter into a win-win relationship with that organization. But this is done with the long-term goal of ultimately being able to outmaneuver that organization and overpower it. So, the Kuomintang, which was the nationalist party during the Chinese war against Japan, it was a rival of the Communist Party, but they entered an alliance with it for the sake of this kind of liberation war that they were fighting. Once that war was over, though, they entered conflict with this nationalist rival. They eventually overcame them. And once they had the upper hand, then the mission was to ensure their own supremacy in the political sphere. So, based on that view of seeing the world, there's a clear pattern that exists in China's more global economic scope. And we've seen signs of this already. So I believe the piece mentions in Kenya, one of the major ports in that country has recently come under Chinese control because of debt negotiations, right, that the country had entered into with China. We have Turkmenistan, as was mentioned earlier. Turkmenistan was angling to kind of work with multiple players in supplying oil. China was able to maneuver in such a way that they basically run that country's oil industry, at least, for the present moment. And so we see a continuing pattern here, and that ultimately, when you have a power that's fundamentally sees economic power as the basis for cultural and political power, it's quite naive in a way to think that as that country becomes globally, maybe not the only dominant power, but one of the global dominant powers, that it will not do what it has done repeatedly in the past, which is to transform its power into hegemony across multiple spheres and not just the economic one.
Well, I think it's important to sort of recognize that it's not necessary that I think economic power becomes cultural power. And I think this was the point made in the piece, wasn't that like it was inevitable that they would turn it into cultural power, but rather that the current approach, where we see mostly just operating within the kind of currently existing world order, within current cultural hegemonies, and gaining economic power, that approach ultimately is not sustainable. And then sort of we have this further analysis that is that well, the Chinese Communist Party is going to be fully aware of this, and it's presumably their intent to pivot to a cultural strategy once they have more economic power. But for now, the way I read the piece was the thesis was that what they're doing kind of is just focused on the economic dimension, economic and political dimension right now, and they're not immediately building that cultural power, and this is not going to be sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, that's correct. So there is something. There is a cause here, and it is discussed toward the end of the article that, for China especially, the mechanism is going to be that as development happens, as a lot of countries finish industrializing in some cases, China won't be able to maintain purely an economic advantage, right? So in the 80s and 90s, for example, they were able to offer a large labor force. As their country has grown wealthier, part of the program seems to be that they're now going to outsource labor and outsource parts of the supply chain to places like Central Asia. So it's not going to be able to stay on the economic axis, so to speak, as it tries to ensure its own power in the world. And yes, so in that sense, it has an incentive to also look at culture and politics. But the major point, the reason why that's not being done yet, as it was tried in the Mao era to a degree, is that the party's own self-conception requires that the economic basis for power be in place before you can exercise it, because this is in a way fundamental to the Marxist analysis. And I'm sort of taking for granted here that the party is basing its view on power in large part on that. That's something that can be debated somewhat. But in order to achieve any other stage of power, the economic basis has to be there.
On the point about Mao, what I found interesting is, well, the article talks about consolidating cultural mimicry into a true rival to American power, and I think it's interesting that, at least according to his physician, his personal physician, who wrote about a 700-page memoir of his account with Mao, he basically argues that
Who is this that wrote that?
Mao's personal physician.
Okay, yeah.
And so the point there was he ascertained through Mao's long-term plans that Mao was very much interested in a cultural synthesis with America, that he was incredibly enamored with the West, also with Western medicine, and had hoped for, not taking China, say, back to any kind of Confucian tradition, but creating some sort of hybrid between China and America that was distinct from either of them separately. Of course, that never really happened, but it's interesting to see the inside perspective there, because at the time, this would have been, I think, the 1950s. That certainly was not the read that analysts had outside of China.
Well, and we're making a certain assumption here, right? Because when we hear the phrase like a synthesis with America, we think America, and we're thinking that means like capitalism, liberal democracy, and so on. I don't think it's actually controversial that a lot of the Chinese political class saw a lot of what they wanted to be in America, but we shouldn't assume that when they were looking at America, the thing that was immediately jumping out to them was like the same things that we're socialized into associating with America because
Right.
we live in the American sphere of influence, right? America for a lot of the world means like the global power, the empire, right, if you want. And that global dominance and even I'd say the industrial development, right, being this like the most advanced country in the world. That's something that I think almost all socialist movements in the 20th century sought to become.
Certainly, it was more cultural and scientific than anything else, because certainly, Mao would not have been open to political developments that reduced his personal power, and we saw this actually in his commentary, his private commentary on the relationship of Khrushchev to Stalin, and the shift in the Soviet Union away from cults of personality, and Mao saw this as a threat to his own power, mostly because he thought that others in the party would try and adopt the same line from Khrushchev and attempt to oust Mao using that kind of development in ideology. So he certainly was not open to the possibility of say liberal democracy. I mean, that was that wasn't even in the question ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to, I think it's probably worth touching on this notion, like what role is it that Marxism plays in the Chinese Communist Party today. And one of you made this remark earlier, like they weren't going back to this Confucian form of society. And I think that kind of centers on the question, right? Because we have these Confucius institutes and so on, and even within China itself, right? There have been kind of allowances made for these traditional Chinese systems of thought to be studied again in some sectors. And I think there's been kind of a myth that China has tried to, like the party itself, right, the political class, has essentially abandoned Marxism and is trying to find some kind of substitute ideology, right? So people talk about state capitalism, or people will, it's some kind of like national state-driven Chinese idea. And it is definitely true, I would say, that like the party wants to be seen as having a sense of continuity with this Chinese idea, but from the Mao era as well, what was Mao seen as accomplishing? It was the rebuilding of the Chinese state. It was making China a sovereign power again, and the development of the party's own doctrine and ideology since then has always been very cautious. And anyone who studied Marxism knows, like, the focus on theory is immense, and the focus on looking at concrete material conditions and situations is like the whole basis for the analysis, right? This is why it's called a scientific form of socialism. So even though a lot of Marxists will, they will treat Marx or Engels or whoever as almost religious, just you can cite them and this makes it correct. But because it takes, at least claims to take, the scientific approach, the idea of iterations and developments within the framework is actually inherent to it. And so when people like Deng and even Xi today come along and say that they've developed the ideology in continuity, that's actually entirely in line with the whole foundation of the party's worldview, right? This is how they're able to adapt and be nimble and survive through war and through cultural revolution and all these things, because the concern is, how do you respond to those conditions in order to establish a political power? And so what applies in this global view that the piece takes applies like on every level from the party's perspective, including domestic.
I mean, we're getting into an interesting tangent here, I think, but on this general question of sort of whether the party has abandoned Marxism or to what extent it has changed Marxism or whatever, one of the questions that I think is important there is like, what's their view on the withering away of the state? Like communism sort of ultimately had as its end, it has this period of development under a state, but then ultimately had this vision that the state kind of goes away in the end. And I wonder if the Chinese theorists still hold to that kind of point of view, or whether they're starting to conceive of the state as a more permanent institution in society.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with China is, right, that I don't believe that the official party line is even that China is a socialist society yet. My understanding is the phrase that gets used is the path to socialism, right? And within the Marxist doctrine itself, the socialist state, there was kind of an early stage where the means of production were, and the class relationship was fundamentally altered. But that in itself wasn't the completion of this shift. So the idea of this higher stage of communism, right, where the state withers away, it's discussed across Marxist thought, but in a sense, it's something that can't be taught. There's almost an event horizon, right? Because what actually happens once the relationship of class is altered is, in a sense, difficult to predict. So the thing is as well, the Marxist conception of the state is quite distinctive in a way, right? It's the hegemony of one class over another. And almost by definition, the Marxist revolution is meant to abolish classes, which differentiate between the different, the modes of production and ownership.
Yeah, but I mean, there's the institution of the actual central power in society. Like, it's not actually. Just speaking in terms of like the reality of the situation, there's some central power in society that's dominating the rest of society and making it sort of revolve around it, right? There's the central power of some empire, and so I'm wondering whether in China, are they still kind of, or were they ever viewing themselves as like sort of fundamentally more of a vanguard that's bringing about some condition that is different from what is currently being worked on, or are they conceiving of themselves as building some more permanent system of institutions? And that's like, it certainly looks like the Chinese Communist Party is kind of building a more permanent system of institutions, but I'm curious how they're actually thinking about it. And then like, so like whether we want to use the term the state with all its like, weird connotations for Marxists, that's sort of aside, but I'm just wondering, is the order that they're building something they perceive to be permanent, or is it a transitional stage to some kind of ultimate millennium?
I just want to jump in and make a basic point about the withering away of the state. I think probably most Marxists would claim that there hasn't been any kind of communist society that has been sufficiently advanced along a communist trajectory where that question could even be considered, right? No society that has had any relationship
the higher
with
stage of communism hasn't been achieved anywhere.
Right.
But there's
close.
The question of whether the state A believes that to be ultimately possible, and B targets it, versus something more like targeting a more direct and permanent.
Well, and that's why you have Marxist offshoots that basically criticize the development of this strong state after a revolutionary period to be the instantiation of a new form of capital or a new ruling class that sort of negates the whole point of the communist mission in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean the Leninist response, and Lenin is in a way considered the most ardent proponent of this dictatorship of the proletariat, this worker state, which is quite authoritarian out of necessity, essentially. But it's worth mentioning, I mean, Lenin himself believed that there would be a withering away of the state. But, if you read something like The State and Revolution, that doesn't really... I think the idea that you just end up with this very free society, that's not quite even how he would see it, because, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, when he discusses that idea, it's essentially that, A, production has become so advanced that, this idea of from each according to his ability to each according to his need, this can be fulfilled. And because the relationship of class exploitation has been abolished, hegemony is no longer necessary. So in that particular sense, the state can wither away. But the actual individual experience of life, he has these lines where he talks about how does the human being become socialized into the communist society. And I mean, it's a quite harsh, highly disciplined society, essentially, that allows that to happen. So there's a Western idea, I think, that is a quite liberal idea, right? That the withering of the way in the state means kind of this absolute freedom of the individual. But my sense, at least, from the cursory reading that I've done, is that that's not really the sort of society that traditional Marxism saw as being able to ensure that the state would no longer be necessary. Does China believe this? Is an interesting question, right? I think that you'd probably have to somehow get hold of internal party discussion and documentation to see if that's something that people believe.
Well, the more important question is whether the state structurally is going to be willing to dismantle itself. That is ultimately
or like
the
what does that mean?
question.
Like it sounds like sort of the Marxist doctrine is getting into this kind of wordplay around what the state means or what the state is or something, but like ultimately in any domain of order there is some central power that is maintaining that order and imposing that order, and or at least like this is sort of how we see it.
But usually, so doctrinal elements that are inconvenient to the perpetuation of that power usually get semantically played with, or discarded in some way. Like, it's very easy to kick the can down the road of dismantling the state according to the withering of the state concept by saying that, oh, comrade, it'll take another 500 years for us to reach that advanced stage of communism.
Right, but that's still like notably different in kind from a state that has said like, actually, no, the state is a permanent institution in any society.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
And we are, we're the vanguard of the ongoing improvement or whatever, but we're a permanent institution. And we're here to sort of maintain order within this domain.
Yeah, well, but it's also important to remember, right, that there was a Marxist presupposition, which was that capitalism sort of artificially constricted production, and that when the socialist society came into being, that production would start flourishing. So the result of that was, I think, in a sense, that it's the coordination continues to exist in the society, but as production reaches a certain level, and remember, because there's no class exploitation, that wealth doesn't need to go to a state that maintains class exploitation. Essentially, what it means that the state withers away is that coordination is no longer dependent on like a centralized power that is needed to maintain the hegemony of the proletariat.
So you think they continue to affirm such a view
I think
like,
in
ultimately
name they
the thing will
probably
not have power?
I feel my sense would be that formally, right, and they do still teach Marxism formally, they would have to maintain that this is probably true. But when I make the claim that the party is Marxist in its way of thinking, I'm probably making this in a more near-term sense, that like the Marxist approach of viewing the world through this kind of materialist analysis is how they approach competition and political survival. Whether they actually believe in this eventual higher stage of communism, I mean, who knows, right?
Sure.
I suppose in a sense you'd have to see if the Chinese form of Marxism is being used as a framework for developing the country, or whether it's still this universal ideological idea. And that's important, right? Because even to the extent that China has started to practice like more cultural and political assertiveness, it has not been in the ideological sense, right? Apart from like very realpolitik geared alliances, like maybe Venezuela, they haven't really tried to export an ideological idea, and the Marxist conception of socialism is internationalist. So there does seem to be a contradiction here.
A point made in the piece, which is that like, or like, this brings us back to the piece, which is that, they're not actually exporting ideology or cultural legitimacy or anything at the current time. And this is ultimately going to be a challenge to them.
One last point I want to make is that it's curious that despite the insistence of the party that it's continuing the Marxist tradition, one of the first major attempts at Western influence is called these things are styled, these institutes are styled after the Confucian tradition.
The Confucius Institutes, right?
Right.
Yeah, well, I think that might be something, like, if we think about the sort of connotations of these various things in the West, like if they started setting up a bunch of Maoist institutions and universities and like started talking about Xi Jinping's, latest theories, I think we'd have a lot less kind of
Friendliness.
interest in,
Sure,
a lot less
of course.
friendliness and a lot less interest in that than Confucius. Confucius is like, oh yeah, man, Eastern philosophy, like it's great.
Yeah, I think there's a certain obfuscation going on there as to the purpose of the Confucius Institute.
Yeah,
Sure.
but ultimately that's actually a really interesting point. Not to drag on too long here, but I think, like, if depending on where the Chinese state goes with respect to Confucius, that actually puts that's a big choice point for the West as well. Because if China, decides that they're sort of not going with Confucius, like, Confucius is a good social thinker, and maybe he should get absorbed into the Western canon, so to speak. And like, so if China was like, oh, actually, we're doing communism, we don't need Confucius anymore, if they continue that line, I could imagine the West sort of becoming more Confucianist. In an interesting way.
I mean,
I'm not sure if that's true. If that would happen,
I think
but
that
it's an interesting idea.
think that there is a because during the Cultural Revolution, for example, there were these movements to essentially attack Confucius, and they saw him as like this bastion of feudalism and so on. But because the Marxist conception of history is of like stages of development that unfold and have these cycles where they then ultimately disintegrate into subsequent stages of development. I think that the party's smart move there would probably to paint Confucius as a heroic, integral thinker of the Chinese tradition within a particular stage of development. I would not see the party trying to jettison any important part of Chinese history, because that continuity is quite important to them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is about all the time we have for this topic. Let's move on to Pasha's Facebook article. We've got about half an hour left.
Okay, so the article is entitled "Facebook's Political Problems Are Inherent to Centralized Social Media." This is an interesting article. I'm just going to briefly summarize the argument. So it starts off, the first big chunk of the piece is basically kind of detailing the history of Facebook's political challenges, in terms of how it's reactions to the timeline changes and privacy stuff and some of the mental health controversy, like in terms of, are people getting sort of addicted to the platform, or is it affecting them in negative ways? And then kind of more recently into the political censorship and political issues. So Facebook has been having these challenges throughout its history. And so with this article, we kind of analyzed, well, what's actually going on there? What's the deeper structural reasons for this? Like, it's kind of, everyone's got their take on sort of the surface level, and we wanted to go a little bit deeper with this. So we kind of pushed the author to have a bit more speculative theory attached to it. And so the more kind of deep dig that the article then goes into is we explore how the structural nature of centralized social media, so not social media in general, but when you have social media that's controlled by a centralized company, how that structural nature affects these issues, like in terms of possible exploitation of the user, in terms of the political dimensions. So if I can briefly summarize those arguments, basically, when you have the platform controlled by a centralized company, and they have a huge UI team that's optimizing the UI for, engagement metrics and the things that are actually just in their interests, which is users spending time on the platform looking at ads. When that's sort of their business model, you kind of have this, and then they have massively asymmetric power with respect to the user. Like, the user kind of has to be there because all their friends are there, and they're not going to get invited to events if they're not on Facebook. and then so they don't have often a huge amount of choice in the matter, and then the company has a huge amount of power in determining all the little nitty gritty of how the UI works and how it entices you to do things. So there's this very asymmetric power relationship where the company's interests are not actually fully aligned with the user's interests, and so we could expect that would produce difficulties for the user's well-being. We see that with some of the controversies around privacy and mental health. And then another big argument that we go into here is that if you have this centralized company that controls this huge piece of the social fabric, that isn't just an economic relation anymore, it's a political relation. That this company now has a huge amount of political power, or the employees that are making decisions about what is going to be the content of people's news feeds, and what's going to be how these features are changing all the time, and so on. Those decisions become political decisions because they affect the structure and the outcomes of society. So some of the obvious examples here are, like, in recent years, a lot of these companies have changed their gun emoji from an actual gun to a water pistol, presumably to try to affect kind of cultural ideas around violence or something. So that's obviously kind of a political move. There's been much work with the emojis in terms of skin colors and representations of different groups. Those things, obviously have a political dimension and are on those grounds, like, they become controversial in some cases. And then, so those are kind of relatively minor things with the emojis. Then you have stuff like the fake news scandals. Facebook's not doing enough to combat fake news. Facebook is doing too much to censor conservatives. Facebook is allowing Russian interference. Facebook is selling data to, like, Cambridge Analytica or whatever the allegation was. So you get this politicization of the choices made by the platform. And so the argument we made is that the politicization of these choices leads to also a politicization of the corporate culture and the general industry around it. And this is inherent. Like, this isn't a decision that they made at Facebook where they decided to politicize, or that they failed to prevent the politicization, but rather that when you have an institution that wields enormous power in society, it will become politicized, because politics is about, who gets to decide how these big social levers are being pulled. So the piece analyzes a bunch of that stuff and ultimately concludes that this political power is going to have to be integrated into the rest of the political order in society. But on the other hand, all the ways that you could sort of think of to do that in an orderly way aren't really compatible with the company's continued existence as it is. So, for example, suppose you wanted to regulate the company's kind of political decisions so that it's not being quite so unrestricted in its choices, and it has to have some level of neutrality or something. Well, the fact that the company has to constantly be tweaking its algorithms and constantly changing how it works to combat things like, real problems like fake news and harassment and clickbait and all that stuff, to cleanly separate that ongoing management of the companies from these political dimensions is actually quite difficult. So that could just like throw a wrench in the business operations of the company to the point where it kind of hastens the obsolescence of those companies. So that's sort of an overview of the arguments in the piece. I thought it was really interesting. We were being a little bit more speculative with this one, but it's an important area of like, how does a society integrate huge new dimensions of political power?
So And there's an interesting point in the discourse right now about possible regulatory options for how the state ought to handle these other sort of rival power centers. And one of the suggestions is removing liability protections for content hosted on their own on social media platforms in an effort to get social media platforms to be fairer in their treatment of users from various political backgrounds. The other option that I've seen discussed is to regulate these entities as common carriers, so they can't simply just refuse customers service, for example. But the problem, I think, with that approach is that an airline is quite a different entity than a social media company that has an enormous amount of influence over the worldviews of, the people in a country. An airline is just like, okay, maybe this person is a bad person morally or politically or something, but does it really matter that they can fly on an airplane? Does that really ultimately matter for much of anything? Does anyone even pay attention to that? Does it mean anything on a wider scale? And the answer there is obviously no. But whether someone has a platform on Facebook or whether someone has a platform on Twitter actually does matter if they are influential enough, because the platform itself, the characteristics of the platform provide power to whatever message is being broadcast in a way that airlines don't. And so this question does not simply go away by regulating it as a common carrier.
And that I think highlights specifically where the conflict of power actually is, right? Because a company like Facebook can't outcompete the state on every metric of what it means to govern a country. But there is this one very important metric, which is in essence tying people together and communication, things that are fundamental because they shape culture, but that the state doesn't have enough information to regulate properly. So one of my favorite parts in the piece was where he discusses Mark Zuckerberg's congressional testimony, right? And I mean, people saw these videos of politicians asking questions which basically demonstrated the state probably doesn't have the capacity to regulate these companies. So there was Senator Orrin Hatch's question, how does Facebook do business without the user fee? And Zuckerberg gives his deadpan, Senator, we run ads, right? Very, very simple things that would need to be known to properly regulate, that government doesn't have a core competency in the way that it's currently structured.
Yeah, and even if you imagine sort of a very intelligent group of people being put together who really understand the issue to kind of come up with some regulation of the thing, I think the sheer stickiness of the problem of separating the day-to-day business of making sure people's news feeds remain high quality and not dominated by junk and hate speech or fake news or Russian interference or whatever all the things are that there's this whole raft of potential problems that happen, and some of them are political, some of them are not political, and some of them are hard to tell the difference. So that's just this really sticky question of regulating those political decisions. There are actually a large number of judgment calls to be made, and the state can't legislate how those judgment calls are going to go. And if they try, then it just becomes, now it's a problem for lawyers and politicians, but the problem still exists. There's still this huge piece of power in society that maybe now is a little bit clumsier, but isn't you haven't gotten rid of its political nature.
So there's a question I wanted to bring up with regards to that, which is about part of the discussion in the end of the piece, right, was this question of decentralization and creating a more user-controlled network. Now, my question there, right, these networks, because things like network effects were discussed in the piece, these networks are useful insofar as they essentially tie a large threshold of people together. And even in a network which is more user-controlled and more decentralized, presumably you're going to get like centers of coordination, because generally speaking, like not all users have the same expertise and even like time, right, to properly administer these kinds of networks. Even if you just had admins, which were, to an extent, that role was voluntarily taken up and that administrative authority was ceded by other users in control, it seems like you would still have a lot of these same effects occurring even with the change in ownership. So I was wondering if you could touch on that from the perspective of the piece.
So basically, there's the first question of like, how are people going to end up on new decentralized platforms against the kind of network effect? And we can like hit that briefly before all the other stuff. So I think one of the sort of feedback, a bit of feedback we got was that like, well, people are already kind of organizing more in private groups than they are on public social media now. Like public social media is like, it's great for broadcasting and talking to like your parents and stuff, but a lot of real social networking is being done like in Slack channels and things like that, and so that's like an interesting development, but that actually like goes towards decentralized social networks. I think the way it's going to happen with decentralized social networks is a decentralized social network platform is going to offer a platform for being able to set up these smaller, more like locally controlled groups that that like just need to exist, and the current platforms like for whatever reason aren't going to work for whoever's doing that. And so if they can get that sort of killer app of, okay, well, we've got our Palladium community and we actually want to bring together like 200 people from our audience to kind of have intellectual discussions. Like, where should we do that? Should we set up like a PHP BB forum, or should we move to some new decentralized social network that maybe is going to be more modern and works better or something? Like, we're probably not going to do a Facebook group for various reasons. And so like, if they can hit that use case, then people will be on these things. And so that kind of leads into the structure that you're talking about, Ash, which is that, like in the absence of big central company controlling how everything goes, you're still going to have people controlling how everything goes, but they're going to be these more local admins of particular communities and so on. But I think this is where it's important to like kind of have awareness of the virtues of localism versus like kind of a universal platform. So if you have these many smaller communities that are much more opt-in and much more local, you have way more voice in these smaller communities, and you have way more exit. And so the user actually does have a considerable degree, sort of like more insurance against abuse in these smaller things. If not, they don't necessarily have like the big procedural controls that a huge company will have, but they'll have like I think like less of an immediately like faceless asymmetric relationship with this huge bureaucracy that like Facebook and so on are becoming. And then the other dimension on that is, from the other side, is the interface of the state or the overall polity to these powerful kind of sub-communities. So in the case of Facebook, you have this one company that has like 300 million users and an enormous amount of political control over, like almost as a single entity over elections in America, over people's political views. So it becomes this kind of rival power center to the current elite or the state as such, that has to either be integrated or otherwise dealt with. Whereas like a constellation of many smaller kind of online little cities, much less likely to be a coordinated political entity, and thus of much less concern at these higher levels of politics.
So basically the digital landscape, rather than being one massive commons that then has to have this large-scale owner to properly administer it, becomes decentralized and divided up into a bunch of smaller commons that are coordinated locally.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, like decentralized social networking looks like privatization of the social fabric. I don't mean like, you know, when we think of privatization, we often think of like, oh well, the government's going to sell some big bureaucracy to some like monopoly company. I don't mean that way. I mean like the thing becomes like, you know, much smaller, more locally administered, and done by like a more market-like process rather than a more crony-like process. Like Facebook can pretend to be a public company, but by its scale, monopoly status, and political power, it is essentially a public utility, and not just a public utility, but a branch of the state almost. And so like that characterization just doesn't exist for, you know, the Palladium social network, the whatever social network, your local neighborhood forum that's run on some decentralized social media. And like we bring up the example of Urbit in particular. I think it's important to have like an explicit example like that. Not to say that Urbit's going to be the thing. I'm optimistic on Urbit, but like more than anything here, it just forms a really good example of like someone having worked through how this thing could work and what it might look like. And the way Urbit envisions things is that it's this unified platform of identity and computing and so on, and particularly social computing, but it essentially forms a platform for people to be able to easily build things like, your neighborhood social network, your intellectual group social network, your, you know, whatever, your little hobby group. It becomes a platform for easily building those things that are in the complete control of the people who built them, rather than having this kind of third party of Facebook being able to unplug you at any time.
Also, there's a follow up there, because as we were on this metaphorical line of discussion, one of the comparisons that actually occurred to me was something like William the Conqueror, right, in England. He doesn't just rule everything in the country on his own. He farms out the local areas to lords and the like, right? So that power and the day-to-day aspects of administration and governments are decentralized, and then what ends up on the sovereign, as it were, plate are the things that have to be coordinated at top level. But in that example, you still actually have a certain top-level coordination, right? So I wonder, even in this decentralized system, sure, you have a local server or something, or a Slack, let's say, very easy example, that's like a gardening club. Well, that's not too important. But if you have another one that's a lot higher value, right? Like, say, like finance, for example. There's a lot of financial industry stuff being discussed within a given community. That's actually something that would still be of political interest. So I'm wondering, do you foresee a like hard roof or a hard ceiling on the level of scaled up coordination that's necessary? Or is it kind of, you're not decentralizing everything and there still is a certain amount of top level coordination, but it's something that the state can actually handle?
Well, it's like how much, like, what do we mean by top level coordination, right? Like you could get a political party organized on one of these social networks, and it's like, a political party is like, basically by definition significant at the national scale, and a political power, and like I think the point is, it's like that particular organization or that particular little sub community has a lot of power, and now they just have tools to like organize whatever they're doing well, like everyone else does. But it's not like the platform itself that becomes politicized, but rather a particular community that happens to be using the platform. And so there, in society, you're never going to have something where there's actual elimination of there being like sub-communities of the polity controlling some aspect of power, right? Like there is in fact this like Wall Street class that kind of controls this, what's going on in this area, or this journalistic class, or a political party or a church or whatever, right? And these things have power, and then the game of the state is kind of to, or whatever system the elite is using to organize. Like these people are kind of by definition the elite, the holders of the preponderance of power in society. There's some set of people who hold power. They need to cooperate among themselves. Usually that's through the vehicle of the state. But there's still that political question of how do you coordinate all these things. But this decentralized social networking doesn't like directly bear on that question, except that it means there's one less huge power dimension that doesn't have to exist. Like in the case of Facebook, you have this big new player at the table, which is Facebook, which like controls people, like has editorial control over people's feeds and all this other cultural power, and like, is potentially hard to negotiate with, or hard to control for whatever the kind of mechanism of elite consensus is. It can be hard to integrate that, and so
so there's still a digital landscape, but this like large scale like super administrator essentially is no longer necessary.
Right.
You administrate at the local level as needed.
Because think of how hard it is to regulate Facebook under, say, common carrier rules, because you essentially have to trust, like, let's say you'll have the overarching common carrier regulation, but you'll allow a lot of judgment calls to be made locally by the company. In the same way that airlines can kick people off the plane for, say, harassment or something. But that really is the question then, isn't it? I think people have been quite successful recently at moving some political positions under what people would refer to as basic norms of human decency or something.
Right, yeah, like a lot of these things are disputes over what even is basic norms of human decency.
What's basic decency, what's harassment, and that is not clear in any sense anymore, because everyone has an incentive to take their preferred political positions and
turn them into those things.
And turn them into those things so that they can get broader agreement. It's a bit of a Mott and Bailey there.
Right. And the fact is that that distinction will always exist and will always be a little bit politicized, but the fact that you have this big centralized platform where if you can get something to be considered by the people in control of it, or the people in control of regulating it, if you can get them to consider something to be a basic norm of human decency and not just your personal politics, then suddenly you've gained this huge amount of power for your personal politics. And so that incentivizes that like weaponization of basic human decency. But like getting back to the problem of like centralized versus decentralized political powers and the problem of the state sort of developing political order, it's really kind of about the dimensionality of the problem. Like, if you have this huge player, Facebook, at the table, you've added another dimension to the problem, which is you've got this big power that needs to be somehow cooperated into the elite system of cooperation, or somehow integrated. Or in the decentralized social media case, you just don't have that problem. You have still the groups that are kind of, all the usual groups, but you don't have that huge central thing. It's like the dimensionality of the problem has been reduced because the state actually doesn't really need to be directly concerned individually with all the little tiny groups. Rather, it needs to be concerned with big, powerful things. And then, like one of the things that comes up in these debates is like whether Facebook has the right as a private platform to kick you off. I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea that, private platforms should be able to kick people off. But also, as I said earlier, Facebook is in actuality not really a private platform anymore because everyone's on it. It has this huge political power in society. There's only one of it, etc. So it becomes like it's not really a private platform. And so, but the decentralized one, even if those individual little sub-cities of the thing have a lot of power, they are in fact private platforms. When they are at that smaller scale, they actually become private platforms, so that argument actually works and actually becomes kind of a satisfying argument rather than just like a frustrating argument. And I think that's key, right? So like to decentralize the social media makes so many of these problems actually go away and kind of like resolve differently and to more satisfaction.
Yeah, you can maintain the principle that you control your own digital space.
Right.
This distinction between private and public, I think, has caused a lot of confusion because people will point to, the legal incorporation of the thing, regardless of the level of political power it attains, and say, see, the thing is private. See, it says right here on the form that it's private.
Yeah, right.
And that's basically a really useless definition of the word private, because when a private entity has started essentially internalizing a lot of the
public functions of society.
A lot of the public functions of society and the state, then, if we're trying to carve up reality, like semantically in a way that makes sense, it doesn't make sense to continue to refer to the thing as private as opposed to public. Like when
if it walks like a state and it quacks like a state, then...
Right, like
then it's a state.
If Facebook is large enough to have a foreign policy, and it does, by the way, then it is effectively a state,
or an arm of the state,
or an arm of the state. Right. That's more what I mean. And this notion of effectively X or effectively Y is the only meaningful definition that counts compared to some kind of autistic discussion about what the entity self-describes as in a way that is beneficial to that own entity. Right?
Yeah, like
of course it wants to self-define as private.
Yeah, and a lot of this self-definition of as private, or like the political actors involved in seizing its public power describe it as private for obvious reasons. That it's just kind of mud in the water. I think the definition of public and private that we should kind of use when considering these things is, well, it's private if it doesn't have the sort of significance in the central public functions of society. And if it does have significance in the central public functions of society, and it is one of the central public functions of society, well, then you kind of have to consider it as public. And I think that's the test, like that's sort of the big distinction between centralized social media like Facebook and decentralized social media like Urbit. Like Urbit itself would be public in the sense that it would be a centralized sort of public function of society, but the individual communities on it would be private in this sense that Facebook on the other hand is, because it is one of these central public functions of society, you can't any longer get away with treating it as a private entity that has the rights of private entities, or has like any of the same analysis as private entities. And that's where I think a lot of this like confusion and frustration comes from in these arguments.
So what happens when the state, like even compare, like let's put this in the context of the US right now. What happens when the state moves past internal opposition to the regulation of these entities and says that it is in fact interested in regulating these entities and finds itself unable to effectively do so? What happens then?
So it might like pull off the regulation. Like it'll probably do something. I think regulation will probably happen, even regulation under common carrier rules or something, but it'll just be like we said, right? It's okay, well, this now becomes a more explicitly public problem of regulating who gets to talk on this platform. But that problematic dimension of power still exists, and now you've hobbled the companies a little bit. So what I would actually predict is, now I don't know if this will actually happen, but if I had to sort of tell a story, it's that the state realizes the public significance of a platform like Facebook, formally makes it have public duties through some scheme of regulation, like a common carrier like regulation, and this sort of works, but doesn't really work, and it becomes a sticky political situation. But But ultimately, it also makes the company less effective at its core business and hastens the obsolescence of the company. Like we already see Facebook kind of becoming uncool. You know, it's somewhere you talk to your grandma. And I think like Facebook being less able to sort of nimbly optimize its newsfeed functions and so on will just kind of like make the platform less attractive and have people leaving for whatever is the new alternative. I mean, right now that's kind of Instagram, which is controlled by Facebook, as far as I understand. But I think in future, the space that was kind of mapped out by these centralized social media companies in terms of the space of like things that people want to do, I think that space will eventually be filled by the decentralized options that people are building, like Urbit, and then there's Tim Berners-Lee has his project of like the next version of the web that kind of has many of the same properties.
Well, looks like we're out of time. Thanks for listening, everyone. This has been the Palladium Podcast Episode 2, and we'll be back next week.
And of course, before we go, remember that Palladium is a 501c3 nonprofit project. We're really trying to create a discourse here whereby we can gather up a bunch of people who are really wanting to think about the problem of how society works and how to make it work better. And we think this is a really important project. This is why we're doing it. And we really appreciate your support. So if you want to donate, just head over to our website, click on the donate link. We'd really appreciate it. It would be really helpful. That's how we keep the project going.
And as a managing editor, I would like to point out that I will be seeking pieces on why velociraptors are objectively the worst dinosaur.
Oh, come on.
Okay, that's enough of that. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next week. See ya.
All right, great. Bye-bye.